got this job. It's an extension. Managed to get a tower up, which is cool. Got the mix. I've already started on the side here. I've just got to scratch that corner. As you can see, we've got the beads on. We've got this fold back. Again, see through the trees. We've got the double doors there. Lovely. And then we've got this wall. So it's mainly prepped, but for now, this is what we're going to be on for the next few days. I'm going to be finishing this off. I was supposed to have some help. Had a labourer with me. He got COVID, so I'm on my own again. So you'll be watching me render this up. You're just going to watch me generally deal with different situations as they come. Working with reveals, working between corner beads, and just generally getting this job looking right. So that's what we're going to be on. Let's do it. Okay, so like I said, I've done the right hand side of the wall. I'm just going to work my way around and you're going to watch me do it. The first thing, I always give the blocks, even it's actually raining the day before I was doing this, but I always give my blocks a light spray down with water. If it's brickwork, I paint SBR on the fronts first. So whether that wall's been hacked off with the existing render or whether it's brickwork that's brand new, I always SBR the bricks. Blockwork, this is ready for rendering, but I always give it a bit of a soak in with water beforehand. This is just a little 10 litre water pump. I'm not going too crazy. You don't want to apply too much water to the blocks just because it can start to swim and the render can lose some grip. So I'm just putting a light haze on, nothing too crazy. And because I was on my own, I did all the mixing, all the labouring, all on my bill. So it just adds to the job, doesn't it? So for anyone who is new to rendering, it can be bloody hard work. It's not an easy trade. A lot of lifting, a lot of mixing, and it's a lot heavier than plastering. But well worth it. Like I said, so let's crack on with the application here. The blocks, they've been sprayed down a little bit. Not too much water, like I said. You just want to give them a gentle dose. And now the biggest tip I can say when applying render is to make sure that you've got lots of pressure. You really want to be pushing the render into the blockwork or into the bricks, whatever you're working on. But you just want to make sure that you put a lot of pressure on whenever you're working there. So all my beads are fixed. I am going to do a video on a bead in the future. I just didn't get around to it on this job because it's pissing it down when I was doing it. It wasn't good for the camera. But still, I am going to do a full video on prepping in terms of the beads, corner beads, fitting beads. But I'm just going to give you a bit of a heads up right now. These are 15mm render beads. They're plastic, so there's no fear of them rusting. But I am going to mention this. If you are going to use any beads in rendering, I'd always recommend it's plastic. They're not as hardy as the steel ones, but if you don't get stainless steel beads, which are a fortune, they will rust, and it's as simple as that. Any renderer knows that especially the older beads, they rust and they shine through your render, and it can be a bloody nightmare. There's obviously no risk of plastic beads rusting, and to be honest, they're quite nice to fit, and they're cheaper. So if you are starting out, I would recommend use plastic render beads. Like I said, I'm working on 15mm. So the first thing is when you are applying your render, just make sure that it is lower than the profile of the bead. You need to make sure that when you're applying the render, you're not already, this is a scratch coat. It's a 2-coat system in rendering, and it's called a scratch coat, and I'll explain why in a minute. But you want to make sure that you're applying about 8mm, I'd say, for your scratch. You want half and half, 8-9 max. And it doesn't really matter in terms of fitness, but what I will say is you want a uniform and you want an even amount of render on the wall. You don't want it to be wavy, because when you apply your top coat, it's going to dry at different times. So just take your time, put a lot of pressure into the render when you're applying it, and just make sure that when you are applying the render, it's not past the beads. I'm going to show you a little trick for that in a minute. We will go into that in a second, but like I said, we're just applying the render, a lot of pressure, and pushing it into the blockwork, which has been sprayed down with a bit of water. I've got a slightly sloppier mix for when I first mix, and that's just so it can take up into the blockwork. I don't have my render too thick. Okay, this is a little thing I've been using. This is called the Ox Speed Skim. Now, never ever use this on the top coat. I'm just using it because I find it was smaller than the beads, and I find I've just got the 1.8 meter feather edge. I just find sometimes it's a bit easier to use a speed skim. But what I'm doing is just taking any high spots off the render. You don't want any, like I said, we're just going back to the old rule of thumb where you want to make sure that there's nothing higher than the beads themselves. So what I'm doing is taking the high spots off the render and then just making sure that nothing's showing past. So again, ideally you'd be using this feather edge. I just use a speed skim for ease, but look what I'm doing. I'm running it from the bead to bead and I'm looking up and I'm making sure that there's even amount of render on that wall. That's what we want to be looking for, a nice even amount of render when you are applying it. And just double check with your rule that you are below the beads. Just make sure that you're not higher than them, because that would be game over. Because if you come to do the top coat and your scratch coat is higher than the beads, then you've kind of lost. So I'm just working along the top now. I've got the bottom edges on. I'm just working through and through. And the main thing is just making sure that you're just putting the pressure into the render. I know I keep banging on about that, but the last thing you want is for your scratch coat to fail. You need to make sure you've got dampness on the blocks and you're applying a lot of pressure. If you are unsure on this background you're working on, by the way, just apply SBR and it's always good rule of thumb. That or render grip, which is a primer for all renders. So if you've got a smooth backing, if you're working on smooth blocks or thermalites, and I'd always use render grip, which is a additive that you apply the block work, brickwork before rendering, and it just gives it a good key. It's basically like using the blue grip but for rendering. That's a real good product and it really helps the render to bind to the background. That's a real good rule of thumb if you're unsure on what you're working on there. Again, all I'm doing is now I'm working along the bead across, making sure that you're just sticking to the parameters kind of set there. So I'm just going to leave you to watch it along for a little minute, and I'm going to get back to you in a minute with the scratch. Okay, I'm going to stop it right there because this is the reason it's called a scratch coat. You basically apply the scratch to the render, and that's so that when you apply the top coat, it's not going to fall off. If you didn't do this, and you got to do this scratching the render when it is slightly taken up, I wouldn't do it when it's still wet, because what happens, the render starts to sag. But basically, if you didn't do this and you'd apply your top coat render, it wouldn't stick and it'd end up all over the floor. So the big reason we apply the scratch coat is, and the scratch to the render, is so when you're applying your top coat it doesn't fall down to the ground. But I will repeat myself there, when you are scratching the render, do it when the render's taken up a little bit. Don't do it straight away, so don't apply the render and start scratching it when you got a little panel. Make sure it's firmed up to the blocks, make sure it's taken up a little bit. Not too much, because you need to be able to apply the scratch, but make sure the render has dried to a point, because you don't want to be scratching it too early, and then what happens is the render sags and it pulls away from the wall. If you get any sagging with your render, whether you apply the render too thick, which is a big thing by the way, when you are applying render, if you apply it too thick to your background, it might sag, and then what will happen is it pulls away from the wall, it loses its grip, and already that strength in the render is gone because it's pulled away from the blockwork itself. The other thing, when you are applying a render, is don't play with it with your trowel. Just apply it and then wait for it to dry, and then use a rule or a speed skim, which is even better because it's plastic. It won't pull the moisture from the back of the render and pull it to the front. Use a rule to flatten the render. Don't keep troweling it. Don't keep playing with it, because what happens is you'll pull the moisture from the back and it again will lose its grip. If the render pulls away, sags, then it's already failed. What happens, I'll tell you a little story. If you do keep playing with your render and apply it too thick, it will just fall off on the floor. I had a job once, this when I was younger. I thought the way to flatten the render was by troweling it flat. So I was troweling it, trying to get it perfect like it was plaster. Kept playing with it, kept going back to it. In the end, the whole lot ended up on the floor, and I'm not even exaggerating. Don't treat rendering like plastering. It's a totally different beast, and it's not tackled the same way. You don't trowel the render flat. So I've worked my way to the side of the building here. We're not far off, I suppose. It's a bit of a slog, but at least the sun's out. But if you can watch, just watch how I'm just applying it. And you always work right to left from rendering. I've had a few comments with some people saying it's left to right. If you're right-handed, it's actually not. It's right to left in rendering. Because what you're doing is you're following the render before yourself. So you're using the heel of your trowel and you're using the render to the right as a guide. And that's kind of how you follow your nose with it, and that's how you keep the render flat. So if you look, it's kind of half and half. You use the foot of your trowel to kind of gauge the thickness as you go. Again, you can give it a quick flatten with a trowel like I have there, but just don't play with it. It's not plastering. You're not troweling it. You're not keep working with it, and it's gonna, it's gonna fix itself. It doesn't work like that. The more you play with the render, essentially, the weaker it's gonna get. So you apply it, and then you use the rule to flatten it. The flatter you can get without playing with it, the better. Again, most people say the scratch coat doesn't matter that much, but I'll be honest, I think the scratch coat is really important to get flat. Because what happens if you have bumpy areas, or if you have areas in the render which are lower and higher than the rest, then when it comes to applying the top coat, it's going to dry at different times. That is a big no-go. I mean, this is part 1 of the video. In part 2, I'm going to talk all about the finishing stage, applying your top coat, how to finish it, how to make it look lovely. But for now, you just really want to focus on getting this stage right, which is applying the render. It's extremely important. It's going to be used all the way through the process. So the main idea is to get it flat without over troweling it. So again, I just work in sections at a time, and then when I feel the render firming up, I'll then scratch it. So this was like half the main wall. It's 3.4 meters high, so it was quite high up, but I mean I did half at a time and then scratched it on the way down. That's why you'll see scratched areas at different times to what I'm working with now, and it's just because you don't want the render to be too firm when you scratch it. There's a fine line. It can set fast, especially the scratch coat, because you've got that block work which is just sucking the moisture out of the render. So just be careful when you're applying your scratch coat that you are aware of it drying. It will take up, it will firm up, and if you're not careful, you'll struggle to scratch it if you leave it for too long. So it's that fine line. Just keep giving it a little touch. After a while, you'll find the right time to scratch it, but if you do it too early, you'll find it sags. But I find it's all part of the learning curve. There's no timings of rendering. It's not like plastering where I can give you a clear-cut guide on when and how to apply your first, second coat. It don't work like that. Rendering, there's too much involved with the elements, the background you're working on. But if you just stick to the rules of giving the background a good key, be it a bit of water or a primer like render grip, then that's good. Make sure you put lots of pressure when you're applying the render. That's a big rule of thumb, and that's something you really got to look out for. Make sure you don't play with the render too much. Make sure you don't over trowel it, because you'll pull the render from the background, which again is a no-go because that leads to failure. That'll mean that the render will essentially fail before it's even had time to dry. And finally, try and get it as flat as possible via preferably a render or a feather edge, which is a steel rule. I'll show you more of that in the next video, part 2. But essentially, you want to get your scratch coat as flat as possible so it's ready for the finish coat, and you're not going to be dealing with too many bumpy and different thicknesses. And oh yeah, I finally forgot, make sure that your scratch coat is not thicker than the beads supplied, or you'll have a nightmare getting it done. So I'll just quickly show you the last bit and then we'll have a recap. So I got all of it scratched today, literally just finished, just got it scratched. So I'm mixing got it on. And yeah, day 2, sorry, after prep. It's all scratched up, ready for some finishing. So, not a bad day. A lot of gear mixed on my own, but it's all good. So, day 2, been a good day for getting the render on. We're going to carry this on and keep it filming. Cheers.